On behalf of QV Mag Friends, I acknowledge the Aboriginal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. But today we're very lucky. Our guest speaker is Ms Polly Flanagan, whose focus is education and I hope a few other things. The COVID period has highlighted for everyone the crucial importance of the work that teachers do. It's very complex. Everyone seemed to think they knew what it was like being a teacher, because after all, we've all been to school. But I think that period really made people appreciate what an important job teachers do. I couldn't think of a better speaker than Polly, really, because her breadth and depth in the educational process is very unusual. I'll get to that in a minute. Born on the west coast of Tasmania, Polly graduated from the University of Tasmania some time ago, and her very first appointment was at Queenstown, so she did the full circle. What follows in Polly's career is a who's who and a what's what of education across states, government, Catholic, independent schools, country schools, city schools, boys-only schools, girls-only schools, co-ed schools, and skills and passion duly acknowledged by appointments to leadership positions. Polly and Polly's husband Martin, who's here today, returned to Tasmania in 2020 just as COVID hit. Not good timing. And they began their retired life following very successful careers, and they continue to be very busy, but in different ways. For example, Polly is the Northern Convener of Friends of the ABC at perhaps the most critical time in the national broadcaster's history. And so a very busy Polly, thank you very much for giving us the time today and looking very forward to hearing what you have to say about education.
Thank you, Jill. That Polly Flanagan sounds quite interesting. I'd like to meet her one day. Now, my notes have disappeared.
Oh, I'll take it.
I could make it up. I could wing it. Okay. So thanks, Jill, for your lovely introduction, and thanks too for the opportunity to speak. I must admit, last week and part of this week I've wondered why... We're right? You want it up a bit? That's because I'm reasonably tall. Is that better? That's better. I wondered why I agreed to do this, but I know I was dobbed in, and I think there are a couple of people in the room that might have had something to do with that, Kim. So I'm not exactly comfortable speaking about myself, so a lot of this is about other things, but anyway, here goes. I do want to acknowledge my husband and my sister, who are sitting in the back row over there, because when I say we, I might mean my family, which means mum, dad and my sister, or it might mean Martin and our children. So that's the we component. Okay, so 6 Proverbs, you'll get to those about a third of the way through. Or maybe, no, that might frighten you. You might think, oh God, we're not up to the Proverbs yet. Maybe halfway through. Through my father's family, I'm a direct descendant of 2 First Fleet convicts, Nathaniel Lucas, who arrived on the Scarborough, and Olivia Gascoigne, who arrived on the Lady Penrhyn. That means I'm probably distantly related to someone, at least someone in this room. Nathaniel and Olivia had 13 children, and their descendants make up the largest family group in Australia. Some of you probably don't even know you're related to them, but I bet you are. At my last school, on the very last week, the fellow who was our bursar came up and He was chatting in the tea room to me, and I discovered he was a descendant of the eldest daughter of Nathaniel and Olivia, and I'm a descendant of the youngest daughter. I was born in 1953, so thank you, Jill, for being cagey about when I went to university, but you can now work that out. I was born in a bush district nursing hospital, really just a small house in Rosebery on the west coast of Tasmania. I lived there until I was 8, and we left because of education. Education is a strong thread in my life. My mother is crucial to my education journey, which I will speak about later. She was the youngest of 9 children and contracted polio in 1937 at the age of 8, and her formal education ceased abruptly. She wore calipers on both legs until she was 15, and I suspect she got around in that pram on the family farm. Her parents didn't have a car, and she was confined to the family farm, a World War I soldier settlement farm on Table Cape at Wynyard. At that time, schools were not equipped to accommodate children with physical disabilities, and this is the only photo we have of my mother at that time. My mother was at one point sent to St Giles here in Launceston. St Giles was purpose-built as a response to the global health crisis, the 1937 polio epidemic. It was run by the Society for the Care of Crippled Children. A newspaper article about St Giles in the Examiner on the 8th of March 1939 was headlined, "St Giles, where little cripples live and laugh and learn." Unthinkable, isn't it? In 1967, an Examiner article featured a plea to drop the use of the word cripple. Thankfully, we don't hear much anymore other than to speak of probably emotional cripples. My mother remembered heading to St Giles on a train that carried children with polio from the northwest coast. She was able to sit up, but those who couldn't, she recalled, were laid on stretchers in the guards van. I don't think that was a happy time. Mum never talked about it other than to speak of a lifelong revulsion of silverbeet and tripe. She did tell us, though, about her brother Jack visiting her in Launceston at St Giles to say goodbye before he headed off to World War II. Jack West never returned. He was captured and brutally executed by the Japanese on Timor. Not before escaping, cutting communication behind enemy lines and trying to steal an aeroplane. Recently, about 3 years ago, he was posthumously awarded a commendation for gallantry, and I'm pleased that my mother, the next of kin, was able to receive that. There it is. And she donated that commendation and that lovely orange ribbon that goes with it to the RSL in Wynyard, where it's now proudly displayed. My mother was a tiny woman, just shy of 5 feet tall. If you asked her, she'd say, "I'm 4 foot 11 and a half." We think she was very generous about the half. She had a bright and curious mind, and who knows what she would have done with a formal education. We'll never know, but she made sure that my sister and I received one. There was no question in our house that we were expected to undertake some form of tertiary education. Leaving school in Year 10, as some of my friends did, was not an option in our house. Thankfully, neither my sister nor I wanted to leave school in Year 10. There was still, in the 1960s, the lingering idea from decades before that educating girls beyond a certain level was a waste, as they would just marry and have children. My mother often stated that to educate a woman was to educate a family. My father was born and raised on the west coast of Tasmania, and when my parents, Meg West and George East, married, that's their honeymoon there, you might recognise the gorge, married. At that time, they lived in Rosebery after they were married. At that time, there was no road to the north. The way out was by train to Burnie in the northwest. You got off at Guildford Junction if you put your car on the train and drove down, or south by car by Queenstown, and you could go up over the Central Highlands as well. The roads were gravel. Rosebery then was considered an isolated community. It was vastly different from the town it is today. It was a close-knit community with civic pride and a community spirit. When I was 8, we moved to Burnie on the northwest coast. My father didn't really want to move, but Mum was determined as she could see that educational opportunities were limited on the West Coast. The local district school went as far as Year 9. I think Dad thought everything would be okay if we left school and got a good job at the mine. Mum had other ideas. To go further than Year 9 meant boarding school in Launceston or Hobart. My mother could see the success rate of girls from the West Coast who headed to boarding school was low. They missed the close-knit community, became homesick and returned. Most married early and had children early. My mother wanted something else for her daughters. How different our lives would have been if Mum had agreed with Dad and we remained in Rosebery. We'll never know. Life is something of a lottery, a game of chance. That's something I've always reminded my students about. When I've stood in front of children, certainly privileged students, and I've said, in the game of life, you drew a really good card. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to play that card? I should perhaps, as an aside, tell the story of my father's very brief time as a boarder at St Virgil's in Hobart. Dad was an only child born on the West Coast, and his parents enrolled him as a boarder at St Virgil's. They travelled to Hobart on the train and took him to stay at the school. Before dinner on his first night, he saw a priest slap a boy at the wash basins. He decided that boarding school was not for him, and he caught the train home. He arrived home before his parents. I suspect my father may have been the shortest stay boarder in the history of St Virgil's. His parents did not send him back. He finished at the local school, studied a trade and became a fitter and turner. There they are, I think certainly before I was born, probably still in that honeymoon period. We not only get a lot of genetic material from our parents, but a raft of beliefs and values, things you grow to love, things that become part of you because you experienced them, heard them, or were immersed in them. Mum's love of the outdoor, camping, silence. We had a shack at Brady's Lake in the Central Highlands and we had many wonderful bush Christmases there. Lack of modern conveniences. Mum and Dad didn't really want any of that, and they had an abhorrence of snobbery. Both Mum and Dad always found snobbery ridiculous, and my parents were very down-to-earth people. One of Dad's mantras was, and still is, speak as you find. Dad instilled in us the notion that you judge a person not by how they treat those above them in the social pecking order, but those below. My sister and I are so in sync with these sentiments, we often share a laugh when in the company of people who feel they are better than others. I've been asked to speak today about my educational journey, and education is a journey. And there I am, aged 5, in my first year of school. In those years 1 to 4, I spent them at the Rosebery District School, and I walked to school. I think now about letting a little girl put on her raincoat and a little case and walk with her mates, but in those days it was safe to do so. Part of that walk took me over a fast-flowing brackish river, I think it was called the Stitt River, and up a bush track. It was usually wet, rained a lot. Today I have a love of fast-flowing brackish rivers, glistening wet bush and its unmistakable smell. It was a safe place to be. Ernie Dingo once told me that Aboriginal people regard themselves as freshwater people or saltwater people. I was at that point a freshwater person. And when I return to the West Coast and travel through vast areas of temperate rainforest, I wind down the window, even if it's raining, and fill my lungs with that marvellous damp smell. I'm told it's called damp funk. Sounds more like a punk band, doesn't it? It's hard to describe, but it has to be some of the freshest air in the world, and it's a very strong connection to my childhood. Maybe in part because I spent so much time with my head out the car window wherever we went because I was invariably car sick. I remember in Rosebery some poor kids in the town. Maybe they weren't poor, but they looked it. Miners earned good money, but some of the children I recall as fairly free range. I think lots of kids were free to roam around the bush, swim in those fast-flowing rivers and swing from treetops, and they did. There was no obsession with safety then. I remember a question in class when I was in grade 3, and I remember the boy who answered the question. The question was, what do you use to wash your hair? My answer was velvet soap, which is probably what 90% of the kids would have answered. But I distinctly remember this boy in my class, he said Solvol. I remember that cement-like soap and was shocked that anyone could use it to wash their hair. I went to brownies, my parents were incredibly involved in community events. My overwhelming memory is of a close-knit community with a genuine community feel. When I was 8, I moved to Kui Primary School for grades 4 to 6 and walked to school beside the ocean. Small boys still got the cane or cuts as they were called. Kui Primary School was on the boundary and still is of Burnie High School. I was discovering a saltwater side. Kids in our neighbourhood in fine weather would come home from school, change, grab a towel and head to the beach. We had to go home once the Tasman Limited train went past, which it did every day just after 5 p.m. If it wasn't beach weather, we could roam the neighbourhood, which was then semi-rural. I was at Burnie High School. That's me in Year 10, Burnie High School, 1966 to 1971. A highlight of Year 7 was the introduction of decimal currency on the 14th of February 1966. You'll remember that jingle. And it was just fantastic if you went to the school canteen and you got some cents in with your pennies as the change for what you purchased, because we had both at one stage. We were streamed early in Year 7. Students were ranked by IQ, something you would never do today. There were 10 E classes, E1 right through to E10. Students in E9 and 10 had special educational needs. At the end of Year 7, students in E1 to 4 had to choose an academic stream for Year 8. Unthinkable now, just crazy. Either physics, chemistry and maths, B, or French, German and art and biology. The classics, humanities, science divide. I chose the humanities stream, or rather it chose me. I can't believe that the school did that, and now students are encouraged to keep their options open as long as they can. In those days, you could matriculate in 1 year, which I did, but I didn't go to uni because none of my friends did. I spent another year at school, and I think that was probably a good thing. If I'd lived in Hobart, I probably would have gone to uni, but I just didn't feel comfortable about heading away not knowing anyone. Burnie High School at that time was a really good school. There were some excellent teachers, and I enjoyed my time there. And I'll be talking about what makes excellent teaching in a moment, but I had an English teacher called John Lamb who excited in me a love of literature, of the spoken word. I remember him playing vinyl records with, Richard Burton playing Shakespearean characters and Dylan Thomas reading Under Milk Wood. It was just the most fabulous thing. He certainly lit a fire in me, and I'll be talking about how good teachers do that in their students. So there I was in graduation, and it was amazing to be at the university in the Whitlam years. Most students weren't burdened with fees, and most of them didn't have to get a job. I was the recipient of an education department studentship that came with a 3-year bond. So the education department paid you your way through university, gave you an allowance, and then you had to teach for 3 years wherever you were sent. I studied a BA and DPed, English, Psychology, History and Politics, majoring in History and Politics. That's a photo of my daughter Bridget, my mum, and me at Bridget's graduation at Monash University, where she received her Master of Arts in International Relations. My teaching experience spans 10 different schools and 13 different principals or headmasters, all different styles. I've seen the Bark and Command, School of Leadership, the Sow the Seeds of Fear, School of Leadership, the I'm Not Really Interested Anymore, School of Leadership, and the Hands-on and Involved Servant Leadership. You can learn a lot from good leadership, but you can learn a lot from poor leadership. Some really poor leaders can teach you a lot, i.e. what not to do in a certain situation. My first school was Murray High School, Queenstown. It was not where I wanted to go. We were asked where we wanted to go, and I think I put down every single place except for Murray High, Queenstown. But anyway, I did see the irony of leaving the West Coast for education and returning for education. I was only there 3 terms. Murray High had a lot of students from poor backgrounds. Mining towns can be pretty rough and tough places. but I enjoyed it. I didn't really want to go there, and I would have been happy to stay. One of the reasons it was difficult was it was very hard to get out on a Friday night after school in the winter, wet, frosty roads. It got dark really quickly. And I remember once heading to the northwest coast, and I got to Hellier Gorge, and if you know Hellier Gorge, it's something like 8 kilometres that just do this. And I saw all these cars parked outside the gorge. I could just see them. Their lights were on. I thought, oh, that's weird. What are they doing? Once I headed in, I knew why they were there. They wanted some sucker like me to head in first and follow me. And that was a pretty hairy ride. But anyway, I moved to Sheffield District High School. You can be moved around on a bonded studentship. It was rural, nestled in the foothills of Mount Roland, not far from Cradle Mountain. It was a totally different school. The children were different. On my first afternoon on bus duty, I asked a student which bus he was going to catch. He said, the bus to paradise. I thought he was being a bit of a smarty pants, but anyway, there was a bus to paradise, and another one said, I get off at nowhere else. The students were a mix from the town, surrounding farms, and the children of hippies from the hills beyond. This was the beginning of the counterculture movement, and I have an enduring memory of farmers' children swapping their white bread jam sandwiches for whole grain sprout lettuce and cheese sandwiches that the hippie kids had. I learned then that parents can't always control what their kids eat, and I see young parents today proudly declare that their child's never had sugar or white bread, and I smile, tempted to say, just you wait. In 1979, I was granted a year's leave of absence by the Education Department and headed overseas for 12 months through Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma, Nepal, India, Egypt, Israel, Greece, Italy, Spain, Morocco, UK. I bought that ticket from Charlie's Discount Travel in Bangkok for $400. I returned to Cosgrove High School in the northern suburbs of Hobart, and in a march against the Franklin Dam, I met an old friend from uni, Martin Flanagan, who was walking behind me. I thought he was his brother, and he thought I was my sister. Anyway, we married, moved to Launceston, where Martin was a journalist with the Examiner newspaper. In Launceston, either side of 2 bouts of maternity leave, I taught at Queechee High and Ravenswood High. In 1985, we moved to Melbourne. Martin was offered a job with the Melbourne Age, so we headed off with 2 daughters, Bridget, who was 3 at the time, and Frankie, who was 8 months old. I agreed to go for 18 months. We stayed 35 years. I always had one eye on Tassie and knew that I would return one day. Our daughters are both involved in education. Bridget is the Marketing and Communications Manager at Wrighton Girls' School in Kew, and Frankie is the head of 10 to 12 curriculum at St John's College in Dandenong. I found adjusting to life in Melbourne difficult. Martin was loving the age and got to travel a bit. I was at home with 2 young children. Initially, our furniture was caught up in a wharf strike, and I didn't know anyone, so I sat on the floor thinking, my God, I'm going to have to get some sort of job. To save my sanity. I saw an ad for a part-time teacher of history and English, 8 hours a week at a boys' college in St Kilda. I knew that Christian Brothers St Kilda, CBC, was there, and I thought with a name like Flanagan there'll be all sorts of assumptions about being an Irish Catholic, which are wrong, but anyway, I should get an interview. I found myself in front of Rabbi Yitzhak Grona, the head of the Lubavitch movement for a Jewish Orthodox sect in Melbourne. He was a large, charismatic man from New York. Yeshiva was an Orthodox Jewish boys' school, K to 12. I had the children with me in the interview and Frankie was in a stroller. The first interview question, which would be criminally negligent today, was, Mrs. Flanagan, are you breastfeeding? I always thought it was a good idea when hijacked with a surprise question to tell the truth. So when I replied, having thought, oh my God, do they do this? Anyway, when I replied in the affirmative, Rabbi Gruner assured me that I was blessed by God. The next question was, how many children do you have? I said, I have 2. He replied, I have 8. He flashed back, and I have memories of that interview. At one stage I laughed, and he asked why. He says, why are you laughing? I said, because I just find you really amusing. I said, I've been to Israel. He flashed back, you've been to New York? I said, no, it was a bit like a tennis match. Anyway, there was a fellow in Melbourne called Rod O'Rourke who had been my headmaster when I was there, and he was a referee for me. And Rabbi Gruner looked down and said, who is this old rock? And I said, well, I'm very surprised you haven't called him, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, you go for a walk around the school and I'll call him. And when I got back, he said, Rock says I should be lucky to have you. I should tell your husband that. a rather unusual interview, I can tell you. So I had a leadership role there. The other thing I should tell you was, getting childcare was really expensive, and it looked like I wasn't going to actually, with childcare in 4 sessions a week, only 8 hours, take home any money. So I decided that I would. I said I couldn't do it for that amount of money, and I'd never asked for money or negotiated a salary in my life. And he said, I said, it's probably not worth my while to do this. And he said, how much do you want? And I went, oh dear, $60. I thought I'll take home $60 a week after childcare. So I picked up the phone to his accountant, and he said, Yankel, get in here, she wants $60 more. Anyway, that was okay. I started there with a leadership role in history and pastoral care. I introduced the teaching of politics at HSC level, which I found fascinating. I found the whole Orthodox Jewish religion fascinating, the separation of boys and girls, so they would run very small classes, like 4, 5, 6 boys in a politics class, and then over the fence there'd be 4, 5, 6 girls in one. There were strict clothing rules. Female teachers couldn't wear trousers, couldn't wear open-toed shoes. Secular studies started at 11 o'clock, so the boys were at school at 7:30 to pray, and then did religion till 10:30, then recess. And senior students, I think the last lesson finished at something like 5:20. In many ways, it was like being in a foreign country for a few hours a day, and it really was utterly, utterly fascinating. Then I moved on to a Catholic school, Sacred Heart Oakley, where I was the head of history, a year level coordinator, then staff coordinator, and then deputy principal. And at that time I completed further study, a postgrad dip in educational administration and a Master of Education at Melbourne University. Then I went on to Presbyterian Ladies College with a role in staff development and appraisal, and I also taught legal studies and history there. And I was getting sort of itchy feet, and Elizabeth Ward, the then principal of PLC, she kept coming into my office with brochures about principalships, and I said, oh no, I don't think so. And I showed her one day the Director of Leadership role at Melbourne Grammar School, and she said, you'd be good at that, but you won't get over the blue stone wall. A woman won't get over the blue stone wall. And I said, well, if they're serious, a woman will. And I became, after several presentations, their first Director of Leadership, in fact, the first in Australia. I'm not sure that the school was ready for that, and it was part of the vision of the then headmaster, Paul Sheehan. There was resistance from some long-serving members of staff. It's not the grammar way. And a prominent parent did ask, what would a woman know about leadership? I had an opportunity to do some interesting things, including setting up a partnership with the Fred Hollows Foundation, taking students to Vietnam and Cambodia to go into eye hospitals and raise money for those very poor hospitals. In 2009, I organised a student leadership conference at Melbourne Grammar. Over 450 students from a variety of schools in Victoria, Tasmania, and even one from Adelaide. The highlight for me was the participation of a young man called Ahmed Kelly. I had met Ahmed at a speech Martin gave at the Melbourne Town Hall. Ahmed and his brother were in an Iraqi orphanage when they were rescued by an amazing woman called Moira Kelly, and many of you would have seen, because there have been documentaries about Moira, and in fact Ahmed was 7 then. Moira has a farm at Kyneton, north of Melbourne, where children with severe disabilities come and live. Ahmed and his brother were born without full limbs. They had double arm and leg deficiency as a result, it is thought, of Saddam Hussein's chemical warfare. Ahmed has prosthetic legs and arms, and Ahmed has prosthetic legs, and arms that finish just below his elbow. He has no hands and no feet. I'd seen footage of him playing football, which he did well. His teammates called him liquid nails, as in hard as nails. As a young schoolboy, he managed on the footy field and he even tackled. But as other boys grew bigger and stronger, Ahmed could not compete. At the Student Leadership Conference, I had a couple of senior students, really good kids from Melbourne Grammar, interview Ahmed on stage, and we showed footage of him playing football. Ahmed was a hit. It's impossible not to be moved by his story and his determination and courage. And it's a great story for teenagers who can be self-absorbed and carry on about not having the latest designer item of clothing or the latest shoes. They really should meet Ahmed. Ahmed moved from footy to swimming. Last week, or the week before, 2 weeks ago, I watched a lot of the Australian National Swimming Championships that were held in Adelaide over Easter, and they were televised on Amazon Prime, having a granddaughter in the competition. I saw Ahmed swim in the para section of those championships. Watching someone swim 100 metres of breaststroke without arms, lower arms or legs is a most humbling experience. I'm privileged to have known Ahmed, and the students at the conference were privileged to have listened to him. And he's represented Australia at the Paralympics a couple of times. So when you go home, Google Ahmed, A-H-M-E-D, Kelly, and there are heaps of stories. I tried to download a couple, but I just couldn't. But there's video footage of him, and it is just amazing. And to see the look on people's faces when he takes off his prosthetic legs and then sort of scrambles to get onto the blocks, and he launches from a sitting position. It's quite an incredible story, and a story I'm privileged to know about because it came to me through education. One day in March 2009, I received a call from a well-known recruitment firm. Are you interested in the principalship of Shelford Girls Grammar? Not sure, I thought. I still had things I wanted to achieve at Melbourne Grammar School. I agreed to come along for a chat, which led to another chat, an interview, a further interview, and an offer of the job at Shelford Girls Grammar as the 10th principal. I did say when offered the job, this is not the oh my God moment I've waited for all my life. I've got to decide whether I've got the energy and the passion to do this job. So I mulled it over for the weekend, and Martin said, I think you'll regret it if you don't do it. So I held that position for 10 years until December 2019, 2 5-year contracts. Shelford is a small independent girls' school in Caulfield. I learnt the privilege and price of leadership. I'll speak about that later. Okay, here come the Proverbs. Do not confine your children to your own learning, for they were born in another time. This is a Hebrew proverb. Too often parents, when they interfere in schools, are interfering because they want their own education. And Jill asked me to talk about my thoughts on the changing educational landscape. Educational psychologist Jean Piaget wrote that the principal goal of education is to create people who are capable of doing new things, not of simply repeating what other generations have done. Not long ago, you could get an education. It was a kind of tangible thing. You could put it in your back pocket and off you went. You were set for life. You learnt at school most of what you needed to know and were set for life. Now learning has to be lifelong and life-wide. We use the expression lifelong learners. These are challenging times for schools, for teachers, for parents and students. The world is changing at an unbelievable pace, and it's often difficult to make sense of those changes. Children born today will routinely live to 100 and beyond. They will probably never drive a car. Self-driving cars will be the thing. It means they can live a lot further away and work in the car on the way to work, even if they do go to work. Many jobs current students will do don't exist yet. So schools have to prepare students for a world teachers and parents won't see and kids can't imagine. Today's children can become almost anything they want. The education system in the 19th and a large part of the 20th century was designed to accommodate the needs of a society where 80% of the workforce did manual labour and 20% were professional. This is the information age now, the knowledge society. So technology is the big game changer in education. In 1943, Thomas Watson, the then chair of IBM, and they produced the first computer in 1943. It was about the size of this room, but anyway, Thomas Watson was asked what he thought the potential world market for computers would be. And he said he thought the potential world market was for 5 computers. Google can search billions of pages of information in a few seconds, and kids are frustrated that it takes so long. Toddlers can Google. There are undoubted benefits of technology, and it's here to stay. It's in the very air our children breathe. It's brilliant for connecting geographically with family and friends. Medical technology saves lives. For the chronically ill who can't get out, students can find information. Then why is it so challenging? Why do people like me have a real fear of what's going on? Well, there's a widespread concern that it might be doing our young people a disservice. I share that concern. In some ways, it's an uncontrolled experiment. We have kids who are social butterflies who flit from one activity screen or piece of information to the next. There is no downtime for the digital native. The internet never says, slow down, savour that sentence, read it again. Think about that idea. It's about next, next, next and next. And I've seen this with my grandchildren. Technology and the obsession with phones. Many schools, and including the one I led, after a while we decided that phones would be banned. You know, you can have it for safety reasons. You bring it to school, you can lock it in your locker, but you can't have it in class and you can't have it in the playground. We wanted kids to have an old-fashioned conversation because I think a lot of them don't know how to do that. There was a girl once that had her phone in her hand in the playground, and I went up and I said, you know, Julia, you shouldn't have that phone. She said, oh, Mrs. Flanagan, I'm not using it, I'm just holding it. Human beings are not machines, and they do need downtime. And we have a generation of students who take more care of their phones than they do of themselves. They need to disconnect. Social media is not that social, really. It's high on data and low on wisdom. Students are so unaccustomed to silence. I read once in America where you can pay a lot of money to go to a motel that's called a black hole motel, and there's no internet connection there. I would think people could save their money and turn their phones off, but they are addictive. So many schools are restricting the use of phones, and I think this is crucial. I'm going to talk a little bit about pornography, which is not what you thought you were going to get when you came here. I'm going to talk about the work of 2 Australians, Marie Crabb and Michael Flood. With 2 colleagues in 2018, I presented at an international conference in Washington, and the title of the presentation was Why Girls' Schools Must Talk About Pornography. In fact, all schools should be talking about pornography. Why? Marie Crabb became interested in pornography's effect on young people because as a social worker, she worked with the perpetrators of violent sexual crimes, and she discovered that the stimulus for many of those crimes was violent pornography. So this is not a pornography bashing stance. I'm not talking about Playboy type images of the past. It's about the ready access children have to pornography and the increasingly violent nature of it. iPhones mean students have porn in their pockets if they want it. Statistics show a high percentage of 12-year-olds have accessed porn. The sad thing is students are getting their sex education from this kind of material, and it's becoming increasingly violent. Violent pornography has become mainstream. And I wonder how far we've come when slapping and choking are seen by young people as normal sexual activity. We have many in the younger generation who believe that what they see is normal. We know it's as real as Batman. Students need to be educated about the reality. I've conducted workshops with teachers and parents about this, and parents are often shocked to learn the nature and extent of the problem. Some schools are doing excellent work in this space. Others cling to outdated notions of sex education which are largely irrelevant to today's students who have moved way beyond that. In my view, schools must help young people have conversations about this and conversations about informed full consent. Some schools are doing great things in this space, and that's to be applauded. Another change is the notion of intelligence. We used to speak of intelligent people being brainy. Academic outcomes usually focused on academic or cognitive attainment. The notion of intelligence, that notion was a fairly one-dimensional one. Those who could read and write well and were good at maths were brainy. Critical and creative thinking, no one ever talked about that. We now recognise different kinds of intelligences. The relevant question now is not how intelligent are you, but how are you intelligent? Today's students need a raft of skills that can't be described as academic. The focus on externally set standards and testing and legislative mandates we can do nothing about provide a narrow measure and limited information and neglect the heart. The TCE, the VCE, the HSC or whatever you call it can't last in its current form. Professor Carol Dweck from Stanford, I think her work's interesting and really important for schools, and she's done a lot of work on mindsets, and she talks about the fixed mindset and the closed mindset. She found that there were two core mindsets about learning and intelligence, the fixed and the growth mindset. You can have both. We all have areas where we feel really challenged outside our comfort zone, triggering us to have a fixed mindset that we can't do a task. I'll give you an example of this. The Preps 1s and 2s at Shelford had a kind of reptile farm that came. And I have an absolute revulsion, horror, fear of reptiles. Anyway, I kind of went into the room, put my big girl blouse on and sat there and smiled while a big fat python was passed around the room and a little baby crocodile that had a hair tie around its snout so it couldn't snap at kids. And the kid said, "Miss Flanagan, pat the python. Miss Flanagan, here, have the..." And I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. And I had a granddaughter in that class and she went home that night and she said, "Grandma's got a closed mindset about reptiles." Grandma does. Okay. Carol Dweck says we focus on the effort, not whether or not you were the best. And there was a father at Shelford once who was fairly high profile, and his daughter, she was fairly free range really, but she was in the school musical, and when it was over and the parents are milling around, I heard him loudly declare, "You were the best." I thought, oh my God, that girl's doomed for failure. We need to get kids to embrace failure, and Carol Dweck talks about the power of yet. Now, I'm not good at that yet. I can't do that yet, leaving it open for the future. We also know more about brain plasticity, neuroplasticity, and that the brain and intelligence are far more malleable than we previously thought. As Jill said, everyone these days has been to school. Everyone has not been to hospital, made a cupboard or been before the courts. No one would presume to tell a lawyer, a cabinet maker or a doctor how to do their job. But the common experience of education means parents can, and sometimes are difficult, interfere and express opinions that are irrelevant. Parents who pay for their child's education often feel that they have a bigger right to complain. I think the problem is greater in independent schools. The parents are the clients and the students are the consumers. And I've often had to remind parents, I've sat them down and I said, "Look, I can educate your daughter for your past or her future, but I can't do both. You choose." We focus now in schools on the importance of human skills. Deloitte UK identified 25 critical human skills that are expected to become even more important as technology evolves. Skills such as empathy, listening, communication, critical thinking and innovation are essentially human. Good schools are increasingly turning their attention to these things. More about good schools. What makes a good school? Japanese proverb, one day with a great teacher. If you had a great teacher, I bet you know that teacher's name, no matter how long ago you went to school. If you had a hopeless one, you probably know their name too. Education is a complex business. It is, and of course always has been, about numeracy and literacy, but education can't just be about transmission. It has to be a process of enabling and capacity building. Good teachers are critical, and you can't have a good school without good teachers. And this is a quote from Lee Iacocca, who was at one time the president of General Motors. In a completely rational society, the best of us would aspire to be teachers, and the rest of us would have to settle for something less, because passing civilisation along from one generation to the next ought to be the highest honour and highest responsibility anyone could have. And I'm pretty sure there are some educators or former educators in this room who know exactly what I'm talking about. So what's a good teacher? Good teachers are people who love teaching and want to connect with young people and engage students in their learning. Teaching and learning are emotional pursuits, and good teaching is about love and engagement. The task is to assist students to navigate the modern world and its complexities. Today, teachers have to encourage young people to nourish and fulfil what drives them and discover the sparks within. A human spark gives people joy, energy, hope and direction. Sparks get us out of the bed in the morning and give us energy and joy. It can be many things. A spark can be a talent such as music, art, writing, sport, comedy or mathematics. It might be a commitment or interest such as social justice, volunteering, love of nature, animal welfare, family. Sparks light fires. Good schools have teachers who light fires. And as I said, if you had a teacher like that, I'm sure you know their name. Palmer J. Parker, in his book The Courage to Teach, had the following to say about fire and learning. Tips, tricks and techniques are not at the heart of education. Fire is. I mean finding light in the darkness, staying warm in the cold world, avoiding being burnt if you can and knowing what brings healing if you can't. This is the knowledge our students really want and the knowledge we owe them, not merely facts and theory, but a deep knowing of what it means to kindle the gift of life in ourselves. Academic John Hattie's extensive research into the factors that promote student learning and success found the number one school influence is the quality of teaching, not the length of the day, not the subjects offered, not the facilities, not the buildings, but the quality of teaching. Teachers matter, and they matter a lot. Good teachers have never mattered more. And perhaps that's why I say that my high school is such a good school, the quality of the teachers at that time. I do remember though, I was in a Year 10 social science class and equal pay for women teachers came in, and the male teacher came into the class and it had just been announced, it was after recess. He said, oh, equal pay, we gave them equal pay, we took all the soft chairs in the staff room. I knew then that there was a battle to fight. Too many kids in the Western world survive rather than thrive. The 21st century world is one of instant gratification, and it's not uncommon for primary school children to be on antidepressants. If it were that easy to remedy, there would be fewer anxious, depressed children, not more. It's tough out there, and schools are finding it tough because so much is expected of them. We have to help young people in our care to navigate the modern world and make wise choices, and increasingly parents look to schools to assist with this. British educationalist Guy Claxton believes that many people are feeling stressed because they don't know how to cope with the difficulties, complexities, challenges and opportunities of living in the 21st century. I used to tell parents that life isn't one endless stream of diluted fun, praise and success. And some parents want that for their children. There are some parents, misguided in my view, who work tirelessly to ensure that their child or children are never disappointed or unhappy. If students crumple because they do not get an hourly fix of praise, they are destined for failure. Helping students embrace the F word, the failure word, will free them from the fear of failure. Churchill said success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. And I want to just speak a little bit about, we used to speak about helicopter parents, parents who hovered over their children and watched their every move. But we now talk about lawnmower parents, parents who move every obstacle in the child's path. Some very well-meaning parents set their children up for failure. Self-esteem, self-efficacy and confidence need to be built up, but never to the stage that ordinary performance is claimed to be extraordinary. Regularly declaring you are the best, you were the best, yours is the best is not what we should be saying. Someone will always be smarter, wealthier, fitter and healthier, more beautiful and more talented. And things have changed in school too. If I went home and said to my mother I was moved to the front of the class, will you ask the teacher to move me back with my friends? She would have said, no way, you obviously did something, I'm not doing that. Well, now you're likely to get several phone calls and nasty emails. Things have changed. So Students have ready access to mind-boggling amount of information, but they don't know what trustworthy information is, and schools have a role to play in this. It requires an extensive skill set. Students need to know what they don't know, and this is where teachers are vitally important. They impart wisdom, provide explanations, guide conversations, encourage dialogue, and ensure there's a genuine exchange of ideas. Teachers have become more important even though teaching and learning has changed. I can't ever remember a teacher saying, "I don't know," when a question was asked. And Martin, my husband Martin, often tells the story at Rosebery State School of asking the teacher what guerrilla warfare was, and rather than say, "Look, I'm not really sure," the teacher said, "Oh, it's because people hide in trees like gorillas." The teacher is no longer the sage on the stage or the guide on the side. A good teacher is now a meddler in the middle, helping students navigate and assess information and apply new knowledge, working collaboratively, thinking critically and creatively, and developing a lifetime commitment to learning. The best app is a teacher. Technology is no substitute for a good teacher and the relationship that teachers build with students. Good teachers, good school leaders and good programs make a good school. Buildings don't make good schools. You don't need a swimming pool. I'm not sure a swimming pool's ever changed any kid's life, a swimming pool at school. A good school can be in a tent, quality relationships and quality teaching. Good parenting and good teaching have never been more important. If you ask what the one-line job description of a parent would be, the answer would probably be someone who works for 20 years to create a successful adult. And that the description of what good teaching is not too different. Good parenting and good teachers make good schools, and parents must be partners with the school. Okay, no one can take your education away from you. All right, I tell kids this. Your worldly goods can be stolen, your house can be burnt down, it can be washed away in floods, but your education can't be stolen, burnt or flooded. What a treasure education is. For some people, you might remember a poor teacher, but many of you will remember the teacher who gave you treasures of learning, educational treasures. Whether it was time they gave you, a sympathetic arm around your shoulder, a love of literature, a fascination of how and why things work, or the joy of the spoken word. And that was what John Lamb gave me. He taught me English and English literature. I loved his classes. I loved to listen to him read a poem or an extract from Shakespeare. I had other good teachers and the odd dud, but it's wonderful the teachers you remember. And I was privileged to meet John Lamb's son in Launceston recently, and he looks just like his father, exactly the same. Only when I went home from meeting him, I realised the son is much older than the man who taught me. It's kind of interesting. Lifelong learning ensures the treasure is built upon and enriched, and the treasure can be passed on. That's why it's important that women were educated and are. Educational leadership. Quality leadership makes a good school. You know that saying, fish rot from the head. Good teachers have to lead by example. I never asked anyone to do anything I wouldn't do myself, and that includes being the lollipop lady one day when she didn't turn up. So I had no high-vis jacket or pole. I just had to plunge myself into the middle of a very busy road and raise my hands. So I did. So you can do anything. If someone said to me, how can you tell a good principal? I would say, take me out into the schoolyard and ask the principal to introduce you to 50 children by name. There are some principals who wouldn't know more than a dozen children's names. Some people see leadership as an end in itself. They get there and don't really know what to do with it once they've got the position. They come without a vision, and being named a leader, getting a position, is the start, not the end. And I used to tell student leadership position holders this. What are you going to do about it? So you want to be the school captain, so what? So here we have, don't forget what it's like to be a sailor because of being a captain yourself, a Tanzanian proverb. Good leaders never forget what it was like to be at the bottom of the pile, to be a new graduate, to feel a little lost and confused. I always say that leadership is a we word, not a me word. And poor leaders often see leadership in terms of me. It's all about them, and they have that self-important strut. It's not the name on the door or the size of your chair, but your behaviour. And not everyone can handle leadership. And it's amazing to see some appointed to a position of leadership and when they weren't before, becoming increasingly controlling and bossy. I've seen that firsthand. You can't lead anyone at a higher level than you are leading yourself. Leadership is hard to define, and when I've worked with student leaders, I said, well, what does leadership mean? And they well, you've got a position. I said, no, that's not what it means. I said, think about friendship. What is friendship? Friendship is what is created, what you initiate, what you build and develop. And leadership's the same. It's what you created, what you create, what you initiate, what you build, what you nurture, what you develop. And the question, why would anyone want to be led by you, is a very good question. And if the answer is ego, prestige or more money, forget it. You shouldn't get the job. One of my favourite quotes is that everyone is a good captain in calm waters. If you go into an organisation, doesn't have to be a school, and everything's running swimmingly, it's pretty easy. It's not till you're tested that you know whether you're a good captain. It's not until you're tested that your true leadership qualities emerge or don't emerge. Leading a school is easy when everything is going well. Parents, students and staff are happy, but you can't please the people all the time. The late Elizabeth Ward, former principal of PLC Melbourne, told me when I became a principal, you will have to be all things to all people at all times. I thought, oh, that's a bit rich. But anyway, I learnt. There's a privilege and price for leadership. So people ask me what it's like, and do you like it, or did you like it? And I said, yes, most moments, most days. I want to talk to you about my most challenging time as a leader. I was in my second year, it was March the 3rd, and the school, because we're a small school, the whole senior school went away on camp at the same time, so they went to different camps. And I was sitting at my desk and I took a call from a staff member who said, the students are okay, but they're working on Paul. Paul was a teacher on the school camp. And it turned out that he had drowned. And the kids were able to communicate this to their parents with their phones, etc. And it was it was Paul's idea to look at biodiversity and go out to a reef, and they only had to cross about 10 metres of water to go into a very safe place where they were going to go snorkelling. And there was a rip and they were washed out to sea. And the kids who had their bronze medallions knew to get on their backs, and they eventually turned up further along the beach. And we don't really know what happened, but Paul sort of came in and was standing up, and a teacher went to grab him and she turned around and he'd gone. So we're not really sure about that. But of course the Herald Sun had to do the whole hero thing about the hero dying, saving children. That probably didn't happen, but it was, I could spend a whole day here talking about that. We had to deal with grieving students, grieving parents, grieving colleagues. Media crews camped outside the gate. I left at 1:30 the next morning, so after midnight, and there were film crews still with bright lights at the school gates. There was a WorkSafe investigation, which was pretty harrowing. Then when they come in after an accident, they're not your friend. They want to see first aid kits on the bus and the use-by dates on saline solution. It was amazing. And a funeral, and I obviously spoke at that funeral. It was very large. And then giving ongoing support for students and staff who'd witnessed the tragedy, and then dealing with the inevitable rumours. We had girls who he was their teacher, but they couldn't go back into the room where he had taught them. So even things like changing the timetable in the rooms so that wasn't a trauma for them. But the hardest part of all was going to tell his wife what happened. I knew that she wouldn't know, so I headed off with my deputy, and I called the police and said, look, I'm going to do this, I want you to come. But they weren't there when we arrived, and I thought, look, if this were my husband, I wouldn't want people waiting outside. So I walked in, and that was pretty amazing. She saw me. She'd heard something in the background on the radio about a teacher and didn't register, and I remember she gasped and said, "How is he?" And I said, "He didn't make it." And that was another journey. So that is the toughest thing, probably the toughest time, and thankfully most people don't have to go through something like that. And I'm nearly finished for those of you looking at your watches. Communication and relationship building are really important. No school can be better than the weakest in the community. What's the purpose of education? It's not a key to a cash register. Making a difference is what education is about. And to do that, students and teachers must be challenged to be the best version of themselves. We've got to encourage our young people to be the best they can for themselves, for their society and for the world, and they need to be exposed to big ideas. Quite some time ago when I was at PLC, I took a group of Year 10 students to Deakin University, which was just up the road, to engage in a day of Socratic dialogue. And they posed a question and they worked with a philosopher. They spent a whole day working out the answer to the question, what matters most in life? And, I just sat, I didn't have any input, I wasn't to have any, but I sat in the room and, girls, my friends are there for me. I don't know how many millions of times I heard that working in girls' school. My mum, they work through things. And in the end, their answer was hope. Hope matters more than anything else in the world, because the girls decided that if you have hope, you can cope with anything. And we have to give our kids hope, and we have to give them courage. And courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just at the end of an exhausting day saying, I'll try again tomorrow. Winston Churchill said courage is what it takes to stand up and speak, but it's also what it takes to sit down and listen. Courage is not the absence of fear. I think Mark Twain said this, but the belief that something is more important than fear. And as Pooh Bear said, it's hard to be brave when you're only a very small animal. But we have to encourage our small animals to be brave. So what does a principal do? I've got a whole lot of slides here I'll go through quickly, but this was a question. So that's what I looked like when I got the job, and that's a commissioning at St Paul's Cathedral. Now, I don't like pomp and ceremony, and Martin and I were walking across Federation Square. You might remember this, Marty. I was a little bit late, and carrying my academic gown, and the bells of St Paul's are going ding, 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 all out over Melbourne. And I said to him, what are they for? And he said, I don't know. Anyway, they were for me, which was quite lovely. The 4-year-old kinder kids at Shelford made a little video, and it said, what does a principal do? And they narrated it. And so I was a puppet, one of those art movable sort of wooden things, and they had white cotton buds for my hair, and I'm pleased to say a pair of bright red high-heeled shoes. So over the voiceover, they said, one little boy said, she collects rubbish, which is me in the yard picking up papers. And he was corrected by a little girl who said with some authority, no, she doesn't. She collects children. So I like the idea that I collected children. So there are many competing demands. I'm going to talk about that, and everyday vision stuff for the future. You have to oversee everything. There can't be any surprises. I'm not a micromanager, but I made it very clear that I didn't want any surprises. So these slides here, and I'll go pretty quickly, but you give a lot of speeches. Those girls are now in Year 12, and that was their first day of school. And I remember most of their names, and that was my first day at school with students, and that was their first day. I'm going backwards, sorry. There we go. So lots of out and about speeches, goodness me, how many speeches, how many presentations. So you do heaps of that, swimming carnivals. That was a fundraiser, and you have to be prepared to do that sort of stuff too. That was a walkathon, and I'm not sure what we were raising money for. This was the Ice Bucket Challenge. There was a lovely girl called Clara, and Clara's standing just there to my right. And she had a brother who had a severe brain disease. And Clara came to my office and said, Mrs. Flanagan, could I raise some money for motor neuron disease? And I said, oh, of course you can, Clara. And she said, well, yes, we've got this idea and we're going to do it at the front of the school. And oh, that's great, Clara, that's great, Clara. Then she said, Mrs. Flanagan, will you do it? And I said, of course I will, Clara. So the whole school was gathered around, and that's the moment. So that's my deputy sitting to my right, and it was a Friday afternoon, and I just thought, I'm just going to sit there and not move. And I must say, it was amazingly refreshing. I had clothes in my office, and I went in and changed, and I thought, oh, I feel fantastic. So I've got there's a trick for you if you're flagging on a Friday afternoon. But, things like footy colours days, now that's my mum and dad and my granddaughter Annie, who's now 13, but there was a grandparents' morning at school and mum and dad happened to be staying with us. And I said, oh, you can go along, you can be great-grandparents, that doesn't matter. And then we obviously had international students, so you have delegations from China, from Japan, parents' cocktail parties, Year 12 valedictory, there's speaking to an old girls, that's an ASS, staff dinner, and of course it's an Anglican school, so there was a bit of schmoozing to do with the vicar over the road as well, and we had some religious ceremonies. So there are long days, evenings. Risk and compliance does just about every principal's head in. I think there are something like 400 pieces of legislation that relate to health and safety communication in schools. And of course welfare is huge, not just student welfare but staff welfare, and sometimes parent welfare where you have a terminal illness or a really nasty divorce or something. So it's a job where you have one eye on the day-to-day, and that can be all-consuming, but the future needs of the school and the demands of education. So I'd felt the call of home for some time. I'm wrapping it up now. I was aware that my parents were ageing and wanted to be able to play a greater role in their lives and to share more time with my sister. I decided not to seek another term of my contract. 2 5-year terms as principals were enough. I was done with the long days, endless meetings. The school was in much better shape than when I took over. There was money in the bank and strong enrolments. It was a good time to go. We bought a house in Launceston in January 2018, rented it and moved in January 2020, just before COVID. 3.5 weeks later, my mother died, and that was quite shocking and unexpected. And that's mum and dad in one of their last wedding anniversaries, I think, sending a photo of some flowers that we had sent. My sister and I, as my dad, we support our almost 92-year-old father who lives independently in Burnie. He still drives, cooks, gardens and cleans. And when I've said, Dad, you could get someone to come in and help you with your housework, they won't do it properly, they don't move the furniture, I've seen them, they vacuum around things, so there's no way. Between us, we make sure that he has one of us visit each week and stay the night. I'm going down this afternoon for a couple of nights. And of course we take food that he wouldn't necessarily cook, food he loved my mother cooking, but it's more our need to do that than his need for us to do it for him. Last year, Friends of the ABC approached me to join, and now I find myself the Northern convener. Anne O'Byrne, I think, was responsible for that. You may have seen a number of posters around town urging people to vote for the ABC. I certainly hope that you have. I, like many people, can't imagine life without the ABC. It's regularly and relentlessly attacked by the Coalition and earmarked for privatisation. The Federal Liberal Council passed a motion to privatise the ABC in 2018, and that motion has not been rescinded. Imagine if former Australian, now American citizen Rupert Murdoch purchased the ABC. The ABC is Australia's most trusted news source. If there's a bad bushfire and you want reliable information, you don't turn to Sky News. Recently, someone pointed out to me that if it were not for the Country Hour on ABC Radio, farmers would not take a lunch break. Public broadcasting has to be defended for the sake of quality, for the sake of independent journalism, and for the sake of democracy. How many royal commissions have we had as the result of ABC's investigative journalism? The BBC is experiencing similar problems in Britain. Friends of the ABC can't and don't tell people how to vote, but we do urge people to think carefully about their vote and factor the fate of the ABC, which has suffered significant funding cuts in excess of $700 million since the coalition's been in power. I would hate this speech to be dragged out of the QV Mag archives in 100 years' time and the reader wondering what the ABC was. I've also taught in Launceston Afghan refugees to drive, and Martin has done that too, and so has my sister, and that's important work, and if you'd like to do that, let me know. I also taught a young Afghani woman to swim. Well, we almost got there. They've had a horrific life, some of these wonderful citizens of Launceston, a tough, horrific past. I want to talk to you about a young woman called Najiba, whom I did some tutoring with, and she's the one I taught to swim. Najiba and her sister had never been to school. I was helping her with an assignment where she was required to write about her memories of school. I said, Najiba, this will be easy. You just talk about having never been to school. Talk about how you, at the age of 6, worked making carpets from 6:30 in the morning till 8:30 at night. She put her assignment in and it came back. I said, how'd you go? She goes, all right. I said, what? The teacher said there were too many ideas. I should have just concentrated on one of them. I was very tempted to contact the university, actually. Last year I was approached by parents to join the board of Launceston Grammar, and one of them's here today. I know that sounds a bit weird, a working class girl, government school educated, on the Launceston Grammar board. The truth is I've spent most of my career in non-government schools and I know them well. In an ideal world there would be no division between schools. A school would be a school, like they are in Finland. I love living in Launceston. It's such a beautiful city. I potter in the garden and do some writing, such as reports, writing for websites. I've got an odd bit of renovation to go. I can't say we because my husband will say, we? I don't need to do it, it's all you. So there you go, I've got a bit of renovation. Regular trips to see Dad on the northwest coast, and we pop up and down to our shack. There's Dad on the east coast. So that's our, there are 2 of our granddaughters in our front yard at our shack on the east coast. We have 5 grandchildren who live in Melbourne. We visit them and they visit us, and life is full. Our old house in Balfour Street was originally a Baptist chapel built by, or part of it, the back part of it, built by a breakaway group of strict communionist Baptists. It opened on Christmas Day in 1867, and it operated briefly as Mr. Cousin's day school, which is fascinating for me as an educator. Sometime later, and a couple of extensions later, created the home we have today. And I really do love the fact that part of the home I live in today was for a while a school. So there she is, that little girl in grade 1 and the one who ended her career in a school. I'm done. Education is indeed a strong thread in my life. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to take questions if anyone has one. All right. Usually only one person has to, and then the rest will ask, because it's a bit of bravery. Off you go.
I'll go. I am a teacher, so I have quite a loud voice anyway. Thank you so much, Polly, for everything that you've said, and so much resonated with me. I have been a school principal for the last 30 years, and I consider myself to be an extraordinarily privileged school principal for many reasons, 2 of the most important being I'm a co-principal. So I'm now on my 3rd co-principal, but I've had the privilege of working with a co-principal for my entire term of school leadership. The second reason I consider myself extremely privileged is because I have maintained a significant teaching role in my leadership position. With that in mind, and with what you have said about the challenge of school leadership, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we might reimagine school leadership, because I recognise what I have is not the norm, and yet it's what I think everybody should be doing.
Yeah, you're lucky in co-principalship that it works. I mean, we could all think of someone in our area of expertise with whom we couldn't work in a close knit situation, and obviously you would have a part in interviewing the people who become your co-principal. But the job is almost too big to do well for one person, and you have to have really good support people. You know, schools now have risk and compliance officers. Now, I used to be that person in the beginning, but in the end I was spending all my time on occupational health and safety and compliance, and you know, I didn't feel that I was in the education space as much as I should be because of the demands of legislative demands. So I employed a risk and compliance person, and that takes a lot off. I think that I think principals have to have a good collegial group and keep talking and sharing. I think that's really important, because you can think, oh my God, you know, the school down the road seems to be doing so well, and you know, it's so tough. But if you're honest, it's really demanding for everyone. And I think, you know, some people have two principals, like an academic principal and a business principal. That's another model. You know, But then I know there's a Catholic school, I think Kilbreda in Melbourne, that has them both working in the same office. They're both their co-principals in the same office. But it's a huge area, and it is evolving. And I don't think people understand how complex it is in terms of the demands. And if you're good at it, you can make it look easy, which it certainly isn't. And I'm not sure I've answered your question. Anyway, yes.
I think my voice is loud enough.
Yes, I can hear.
I just wanted to ask the question about numbers in schools. I have had a very, very long 40 years of teaching in the past, and I found that the schools where you were a smaller number, the collegiality required the principal really to be a catalyst for everything that happened, and the children were part of that bigger picture of being important. And working with students with disabilities, which was part of my career as well, I did find that engagement and inclusion is not something you can build. It's something that has to be innate, and it has to be built from the top down. And a good principal is a good school, in my opinion.
Thanks for that comment. I do think smaller schools have an advantage in that sense, in that, you know, I knew every kid's name in the school, and that would be impossible if the school had 1,500 students, 2,000 students, but it had at most 640, 650. So I do think there's a greater sense of community. All of the staff can get together. There are some schools in Melbourne where you'll say, oh, I know so-and-so who teaches there, do you? And they go, oh no, I've never met them, because they're compartmentalised, a bit more like factories. You've got this over here and this over here and this over here, a bit like the university is going to become, Kim. And you can work in a space and not know anyone, whereas if you've got one staff room, one common room, and smaller classes, I agree with you. It's a privilege to be in those schools. Yeah, and the principal's more hands-on. Yeah, hands-on. Yeah.
Holly, I think I'll save you. Well, thank you so much, Polly. That was fascinating. Really, really special. And I know that we could stay here and ask questions for ages, but people get a bit, their parking's expired, and parking's always a real issue here, so I apologise for that. And I also apologise, Polly, we didn't put a glass of water.
That's all right. I had a bottle here and I didn't need to open it.
Right,
Yeah,
good. I was worried about that. And so thank you so very much. So another big round of applause. And now just a quick advertisement for next month. On May the 25th, same time, same place, we have, picking up from one of the themes of today, community involvement, we have Mike McCausland, who's going to talk about his various roles in community groups. Mike is a serial friend, capital F, And he's a friend of this, a friend of that, and what have you, including a friend of the QV mag. And he's going to speak about how it's such a mutually beneficial arrangement to be a volunteer, to put your heart into something you love, to meet like-minded people, brings the individual such benefits. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I know Mike will do it with his usual charm and sense of humour, and it'll be very informative and entertaining. But thank you, Polly, again very, very much.